In the isolated Montana Territory mountains during the winter of 1876, a German doctor named Theodor Brennan made a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Medical records documenting 5 generations of deliberate inbreeding within a single Irish family were found by him inside a remote cabin, 23 miles from the nearest settlement. But the most disturbing part was still to come. Preserved beneath the floorboards and wrapped in oiled cloth were the remains of 7 infants, all bearing identical deformities. According to their own parents, these marks rendered them unworthy of life. For over a century, the Donnelly family had been practicing selective infanticide, eliminating any child born with visible genetic defects to maintain their carefully constructed facade of normalcy. Everything the medical community believed about heredity, family bonds, and the lengths people would go to protect their bloodline's dark secrets would be challenged by what Dr. Brennan discovered next. His uncovered evidence suggested this was not a case of isolated frontier madness, but part of a deliberate genetic experiment. This experiment had been refined and perfected across generations, spanning 2 continents and nearly 100 years of carefully concealed family practices. Before the story of the Donnelly family and their horrific genetic legacy continues, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. Also, let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. Hearing from our worldwide community of mystery enthusiasts is something we love. Bringing you more stories like this one is helped by your engagement. Stories that reveal the darkest corners of American history. The story Dr. Brennan would later document in his private journals began not in Montana's unforgiving wilderness, but in the rolling green hills of County Cork, Ireland. It was there, during the harsh winter of 1798, that the Donnelly bloodline first took its twisted turn toward genetic catastrophe. The very edge of American civilization was represented by the Montana Territory of 1874, a land where federal authority existed more in theory than practice. Barely 8,000 souls were boasted by Helena, the territorial capital, clustered around the mining operations that had sparked the region's growth. Only scattered mining camps, isolated homesteads, and native tribes, still actively resisting white settlers' encroachment, were held by the surrounding mountains. A landscape carved by violence and shaped by desperation was this, where families could disappear for months without anyone asking questions, where lives were regularly claimed by the harsh winters, and where the territorial government's reach extended only as far as its scattered deputies could ride through treacherous mountain passes. By 1874, the gold rush that had initially drawn settlers to Montana was beginning to wane, leaving behind abandoned claims and desperate men willing to try anything for survival. Across hundreds of miles of wilderness, supply lines stretched thin, making even basic necessities scarce and expensive. Virtually non-existent outside Helena was medical care. And even there it consisted mainly of army surgeons and self-taught frontier doctors whose knowledge was limited to treating gunshot wounds and setting broken bones. Precisely this isolation and lack of oversight is what made Montana Territory attractive to certain types of settlers, those who needed to disappear from civilized society and its inconvenient questions. Into this unforgiving landscape came Patrick Donnelly and his wife Bridget, along with their 4 surviving children, Seamus, age 19, Moira, 17, Colleen, 15, and young Declan, barely 12. A freight wagon brought them to Helena in September of 1874. Their possessions were carefully packed in wooden crates that suggested wealth unusual for typical Irish immigrants. A successful potato farmer fleeing the lingering effects of the Irish famine was how Patrick presented himself, but his hand showed none of the calluses typical of agricultural work. Instead, his fingers bore the ink stains of a man accustomed to record keeping, and his speech carried the educated accent of someone who had received formal schooling, rare luxuries for an Irish peasant of that era. A woman perpetually on the edge of a nervous collapse was how Bridget Donnelly struck observers. Small-boned and prematurely aged, she rarely spoke above a whisper and kept her children close with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Exclusively in gold coin she paid for supplies, local merchants noted, counting each one multiple times before reluctantly parting with it. A haunted quality was held by her eyes that suggested she had witnessed horrors that went far beyond the typical hardships of frontier life. What the Territorial Land Office didn't know was that the Donnellys carried elaborately falsified papers from New York, claiming residence in Brooklyn for 3 years prior to their westward journey. Expertly forged were the documents, complete with fake employment records and fabricated references that would have fooled all but the most thorough investigation. In reality, they had never lived in New York. They had fled directly from Ireland after a scandal that had shaken their rural community to its core, a scandal that involved the local parish priest discovering what he called an abomination against God and nature within their extended family. So horrified by what he discovered about the Donnelly family practices had Father Michael O'Sullivan become, a man known for his discretion regarding parishioners' private struggles, that he threatened immediate excommunication and exposure to British authorities. The priest's usually steady hand had trembled as he wrote his final warning to Patrick Donnelly: "What you have done in the name of bloodline purity is a sin that cries out to heaven for vengeance. Leave this parish immediately, or I will ensure that every soul in County Cork knows the true nature of your family's abominations." From the territorial government, Patrick had purchased 160 acres of remote mountain land, paying in gold coins that raised no suspicions in a territory where such currency was common among former miners and prospectors. In a narrow valley between two steep ridges sat the land, accessible only by a treacherous mountain trail that became completely impassable during the worst winter months. So complete was the isolation that smoke from their cabin chimney couldn't be seen from any neighboring homestead, and the nearest water source, a spring-fed creek, flowed only during the brief summer months before freezing solid for nearly half the year. For a family that desperately needed to hide from the world, the location was perfect. But it also presented challenges that would test even their carefully planned survival strategies. Barely 4 months lasted the growing season at that altitude, requiring intensive agricultural knowledge to produce enough food for winter survival. In a single night, the extreme cold could kill livestock if proper precautions weren't taken. And many frontier families had been driven to madness or suicide by the psychological pressure of complete isolation for 6 months of every year. Yet the Donnellys built their homestead with the efficiency of people who had faced similar challenges before. A sturdy log cabin with thick walls designed to retain heat was constructed by Patrick and his sons, with small windows that minimized heat loss and a complex system of interior partitions that could be sealed off during the coldest weather. Knowledge of building techniques that went beyond typical frontier skills was shown by the construction, suggesting either previous experience with extreme climates or consultation with experts before their arrival in Montana. With methodical precision that impressed even experienced mountain dwellers, Bridget and the girls prepared for their first Montana winter. Techniques that maximized storage space and minimized spoilage were used by them to preserve meat. They cultivated crops specifically chosen for their ability to grow in short seasons and poor soil, and established rationing systems for supplies that showed mathematical precision unusual for supposedly uneducated Irish peasants. But peculiarities that set the Donnellys apart from other frontier families were noted by neighbors who occasionally encountered them during supply runs to Helena. Striking resemblances to one another were borne by the family members that went far beyond normal family traits. An almost uncanny uniformity of appearance was created by their pale blue eyes, sharp angular features, and unusually long fingers. Behavioral patterns that seemed simultaneously advanced and disturbing were displayed by the children. Remarkable intelligence and self-discipline for their ages were shown by them, but also a weariness around strangers and a submissiveness to parental authority that suggested fear rather than respect. Most unsettling were the conversations overheard by Jake Harrison, the territorial mail carrier who made monthly runs through the mountain settlements. Frequently in Irish Gaelic the family spoke, but even when using English, their discussions contained references to maintaining the purity of the line, the strength that comes from proper breeding, and the sacrifices necessary for family advancement. The typical concerns of frontier families struggling for basic survival, these were not. They suggested deeper, more disturbing motivations for their isolated lifestyle. In March of 1875, when the spring thaw finally opened the mountain passes after 6 months of complete isolation, the first sign that something was deeply wrong with the Donnelly family emerged. Making his first mail run since the previous October, Jake Harrison arrived at their cabin to deliver government correspondence and immediately sensed that something terrible had happened during the long winter months. Signs of recent alterations were shown by the cabin itself. New boards covered what appeared to be holes in the walls, fresh chinking filled gaps that suggested violence or struggle, and despite the frozen ground, evidence of significant digging was borne by the area around the building. Permeating the entire homestead was a sickly sweet odor that Harrison recognized from his years of frontier experience as the lingering scent of death and decay. this was the most disturbing thing. At the door, Bridget Donnelly met him. So dramatically changed was her appearance that Harrison initially didn't recognize her. The woman who had arrived in Montana just 6 months earlier as a nervous but relatively healthy frontier wife now looked haggard and hollow-eyed, her hands trembling with what appeared to be chronic anxiety. Loose on a frame that had lost significant weight hung her clothing, and prematurely grey at the temples had her hair gone. As if she hadn't used it in weeks, her voice cracked when she attempted to speak. The winter was difficult, she managed to whisper, glancing nervously toward the cabin's interior. "We lost? We had complications." What he witnessed during that March afternoon would later become crucial evidence in understanding the family's dark history. Harrison found the family in the midst of what appeared to be a difficult birth, with Bridget in active labor attended only by her teenage daughter, Moira. A clinical precision that suggested extensive previous experience with similar situations was how the scene was orchestrated. Clearly malformed was the infant that emerged. Its spine was curved in an unnatural S-shape, its left arm ended in a clubbed hand with only 3 fingers, and disproportionately large was its head with a pronounced sloping forehead that indicated severe developmental abnormalities. Labored was the child's breathing, and a weak, mewling quality that suggested internal complications beyond the visible deformities was had by its cries. But the family's reaction to this obviously suffering infant was what disturbed Harrison most. Rather than the grief, concern, or frantic efforts to help that he expected from parents facing such a tragedy, he observed what he later described as a cold, calculated assessment in their eyes. Meaningful glances were exchanged by Patrick and Bridget while speaking to each other in rapid Irish Gaelic that Harrison couldn't understand. Not surprise or anguish, but rather a discussion of predetermined procedures for handling a familiar situation was suggested by their tone. "The child won't survive the week," Patrick announced with clinical detachment, though the infant's breathing appeared relatively strong and its cries, while weak, suggested basic vitality. "The mountain air is too harsh for one so delicate. It's God's mercy, really, better to take them young than let them suffer." Immediately to Helena to fetch a doctor was offered by Harrison, emphasizing that even severely deformed infants sometimes survived with proper medical care, but firmly refused by Patrick. Growing hard with an authority that brooked no argument were his pale blue eyes. "We know how to handle our own troubles," he said, placing a possessive hand on his wife's shoulder. "It's the Lord's will that some children aren't meant for this world. Interfering with divine judgment would be a sin against nature itself." Rehearse struck the religious justification, as if Patrick had delivered similar explanations many times before. Also present in his tone was an underlying threat that suggested serious consequences for anyone who might interfere with the family's private handling of the situation. Expressions that showed no surprise at finding their mother in labor or their newest sibling obviously deformed were worn by Seamus and young Declan, who had been working outside during the birth, suggesting this wasn't the first such birth they had witnessed. When Harrison returned 2 weeks later with a routine mail delivery, the infant was gone. With red-rimmed but completely dry eyes, the look of someone who had exhausted their capacity for grief rather than someone experiencing fresh loss, Bridget met him at the door. "Lost the baby 3 days after you left," she reported in a voice devoid of emotion. "Buried him behind the cabin next to the others. The weak don't survive out here, and it's better that way." Chills through Harrison's spine were sent by her phrase, "next to the others." For the first time, he now noticed a row of small wooden crosses marking fresh-turned earth behind the cabin. For graves he counted, all too small for adult burials, all marked with crude dates spanning the past 8 months. Staggering were the implications. Multiple infants during their first year in Montana had been lost by the Donnellys, losses that had never been reported to territorial authorities as required by law. Wrong to Harrison's experienced eye looked the graves themselves. In a pattern that suggested hasty, panicked work rather than the careful burial of beloved children was the disturbed dirt. Uniform in size and construction were the crosses, as if made in advance rather than crafted individually for each loss, and systematic planning rather than random tragedy was suggested by the spacing between graves. A neat row that left space for additional burials was how they were arranged. That summer, as Harrison continued his monthly mail runs, careful attention to the Donnelly family dynamics began to be paid by him. A picture of a household operating under rules and pressures that had nothing to do with typical frontier survival was what he observed gradually painted. The careful precision of people who knew that mistakes carried severe consequences was how the children moved, and patterns of communication that suggested shared knowledge of family secrets too dangerous to discuss openly were shown by their interactions with each other. Despite being only 17 and 15, Moira and Colleen carried themselves with the knowledge and weariness of much older women. Efficiency that went beyond normal teenage competence was how they handled domestic tasks. But a haunted quality that suggested they had witnessed things that fundamentally changed their understanding of family relationships was held by their eyes. A deference that seemed rooted in fear rather than respect was carried by their voices when they spoke to their parents. A pronounced stutter that seemed to worsen whenever his father was present had been developed by Seamus, the eldest son, at 19. At sudden movements he flinched and avoided eye contact with anyone outside the immediate family. His reaction to questions about family life was the most disturbing. He would begin to respond normally, then catch himself and fall silent as if remembering consequences for revealing family information. Young Declan appeared the most normal of the children, but Harrison caught him once staring at the small cemetery behind the cabin with an expression of terror rather than sadness. When asked about his deceased siblings, the boy had responded, "Sometimes babies aren't right, and father says God doesn't want them to suffer, but sometimes I think maybe God didn't decide." As if realizing he had said something forbidden, the child had immediately clapped his hand over his mouth and refused to speak another word during Harrison's entire visit. Most disturbing were the conversations Harrison sometimes overheard when approaching the cabin quietly through the forest. Frequently about keeping the line pure, maintaining the strength of the blood, and the sacrifices their ancestors made to preserve what matters, the family spoke. Irish phrases that Harrison couldn't translate were used by them, but the tone suggested rituals or traditions that went far beyond normal family customs. There were references to the others back home, what happened to the weak ones, and most chillingly, discussions of which children show the signs and how to handle the imperfect ones. A picture of a family operating according to beliefs and practices that predated their arrival in Montana by many years, possibly generations, was painted by these conversations. Not just a refuge from civilization was the isolated mountain homestead. It was a carefully chosen location where traditions that would be impossible to maintain under the scrutiny of normal community life could be continued by the family. As 1875 progressed into its harsh winter months, complete once again became the Donnelly family's isolation. From November through March, snow blocked the mountain passes, cutting them off entirely from the outside world for the second time since their arrival in Montana Territory. But it was during this second period of isolation that the true nature of their genetic legacy began to manifest in ways that would eventually draw the attention of territorial authorities and shock even the frontier's hardened residents. The territorial physician who would later investigate the family, Dr. Theodore Brennan, had arrived in Helena in October 1875, carrying with him medical texts and knowledge that represented the cutting edge of hereditary science. Additional training in Berlin and Edinburgh and a graduate of the University of Vienna, Brennan had studied under physicians who were just beginning to understand the mechanisms of genetic inheritance. Works by Francis Galton and other pioneers of what would later become known as genetics were contained in his medical library, giving him knowledge that wouldn't become common medical understanding for decades to come. Not for adventure or profit had Brennan come to Montana Territory, but to escape a professional scandal in Europe. Conclusions about human breeding that his colleagues found disturbing had been led to by his research into hereditary traits, and his vocal support for controlled reproduction to improve the human species had made him persona non grata in respectable medical circles. Anonymity and the freedom to pursue his scientific interests without institutional oversight were offered to him by the frontier. Ironically, the same freedom that had attracted the Donnelly family for their own disturbing purposes. During the winter of 1875 to 1876, Brennan received his first hint that something was seriously amiss in the mountain valleys when Jake Harrison arrived at his Helena office in February. Having risked the dangerous winter trail to seek medical consultation, Harrison described phenomena that defied his 8 years of experience in the Montana wilderness. Strange lights seen coming from the Donnelly cabin at odd hours of the night, smoke patterns that suggested fires being burned at unusual times and temperatures, and most disturbing of all, sounds that carried across the frozen landscape during the still winter nights. Dr. Harrison said, his weathered face creased with worry and confusion. "I've been carrying mail through these mountains for 8 years. I know the difference between normal frontier hardship and something genuinely wrong. What I'm hearing from that cabin in the dead of winter, it's not the sound of people dealing with ordinary troubles. There's crying that goes on for hours, then stops so suddenly it's like someone threw a switch. And there's singing, if you can call it that doesn't sound quite human. The melody is wrong, like it's meant for voices that don't work the same way ours do." Visual phenomena that troubled his practical frontier sensibilities were also reported by Harrison. At times when fuel conservation should have been critical for winter survival, lights burning were shown by the Donnelly cabin. Activities requiring sustained light during the darkest hours of night, activities that didn't match normal family routines, were suggested by the patterns of illumination. Most disturbing were the occasions when Harrison glimpsed figures moving outside the cabin during blizzard conditions that should have made outdoor activity impossible. Figures that seemed unusually tall or moved with gaits that didn't look entirely human in the shifting snow and shadows. Immediately aroused by Harrison's descriptions were Brennan's medical instincts, but any journey to the Donnelly homestead was made absolutely impossible by the winter weather. By snow depths that made travel suicidal were blocked the mountain passes, and even if he could have reached the cabin, winter emergency visits were typically requested only for life-threatening situations that couldn't wait for spring. Never had the Donnelly family requested medical assistance despite the obvious health problems Harrison had described. Instead of attempting a dangerous winter journey, Brennan began researching Irish immigration records and territorial archives, looking for any available information about the family's background and previous medical history. More questions than answers were raised by what he discovered, and a picture of systematic deception that suggested the family's problems went far deeper than simple frontier hardship was painted. From County Cork, Ireland, the Donnellys had claimed to be fleeing poverty and crop failures that affected rural Irish communities throughout the 1860s and early 1870s. Detailed stories about lost relatives, destroyed farms, and economic circumstances that forced them to seek opportunities in America were contained in their immigration papers. But inconsistencies that strongly suggested elaborate falsification were revealed by careful cross-referencing of their claims with official Irish parish records. Through church baptismal and marriage records that normally provided reliable genealogical information, the listed relatives in Ireland couldn't be verified. Existing land ownership records from County Cork weren't matched by the described farm locations. Most troubling, the significant amount of gold the family had used to purchase their Montana property, pay for transcontinental transportation, and establish their isolated homestead wasn't matched by the stated reasons for immigration, crop failures and poverty. More disturbing were reports Brennan found buried in New York immigration files, documents that immigration officials had apparently failed to follow up properly. Indeed, a family named Donnelly had passed through Ellis Island in 1874, but they had been flagged by medical inspectors for concerning physical characteristics among the children that suggested possible genetic abnormalities. Signs of developmental irregularities consistent with hereditary defects were described in the medical report, and it was noted that the parents had become increasingly aggressive and evasive when questioned about their family medical history. That the family be detained for extended medical evaluation had been recommended by the immigration medical inspector, Dr. Samuel Morrison, but his report had been overruled by administrative officials eager to process the large numbers of immigrants passing through Ellis Island daily. That his concerns went beyond simple medical abnormalities were suggested by Morrison's notes. Behavioral patterns in the family that suggested systematic concealment of information relevant to public health and safety had been observed by him. As Brennan delved deeper into available records, references to Irish families named Donnelly in other American communities were discovered by him. Families that had arrived at different times, but showed similar patterns of behavior. Attention from local authorities in 1871 for unusually high infant mortality rates had been attracted by a Donnelly family in Pennsylvania. Investigated by county officials in 1873 for possible child neglect had been another Donnelly family in Ohio, though the investigation had been dropped when the family suddenly relocated without leaving forwarding information. That the Montana Donnellys weren't isolated criminals, but part of a larger network of related families who shared similar practices and moved frequently to avoid official scrutiny was suggested by the pattern. Staggering were the implications. If these were all branches of the same extended family, their genetic manipulation and systematic infanticide might have been practiced across multiple states and involved dozens of victims over many years. As spring approached and the mountain passes began to clear, increasingly obsessed with the mystery of the Donnelly family found himself Brennan. That isolated populations often developed genetic problems due to limited breeding pools, a well-documented phenomenon in remote communities throughout history, was told to him by his professional training. But a pattern far more deliberate and systematic than simple geographic isolation could explain was suggested by something about this particular family. That the Donnellys represented something unprecedented in his medical experience, a family that had deliberately chosen to pursue genetic experimentation on themselves regardless of the consequences for their children or the broader community, convinced Brennan the combination of Harrison's disturbing observations, the suspicious immigration records, and the evidence of possible connections to similar families in other states. When the spring thaw of 1876 finally opened the mountain trails, the decision to visit the Donnelly homestead personally was made by Dr. Brennan, ostensibly to provide routine medical services to an isolated frontier family. His understanding of human nature, genetic science, and the lengths to which people would go to preserve family secrets that spanned multiple generations would be fundamentally changed by what he found there. A full day of difficult travel through terrain that seemed deliberately chosen for its inaccessibility was required by the journey to the Donnelly cabin. Through dense forests, across unstable creek beds, and up steep mountain slopes that would have challenged even experienced horsemen wound the trail. So complete was the isolation that Brennan encountered no other travelers, no signs of other homesteads, and no evidence that anyone else had used the trail in months. Deceptively normal from the outside appeared the cabin itself, well-built, well-maintained, with signs of careful farming and successful animal husbandry that suggested a family adapting well to frontier life. Evidence of hard work and intelligent land use was shown by the immediate surroundings, carefully tended vegetable gardens, efficient livestock shelters, and water management systems that demonstrated sophisticated agricultural knowledge. But troubling details that most visitors would have overlooked were immediately noticed by Brennan's medically trained eye. Far too many graves for a family that claimed to have lost only occasional infants to the harsh frontier conditions were contained in the family cemetery behind the cabin. 11 wooden crosses were counted by Brennan, all marking plots that were clearly too small for adult burials, all carved with dates that showed deaths occurring at suspiciously regular intervals rather than the random clustering typical of epidemic disease or severe weather casualties. Systematic planning rather than desperate responses to unexpected tragedies was suggested by the neat rows in which the graves themselves were arranged. More disturbing was the evidence of recent expansion in the cemetery area. That additional grave sites were being prepared in advance was suggested by fresh tool marks in the surrounding trees and recently moved earth. That the family expected future deaths rather than hoping to avoid them was implied by preparations. As if they had been made in batches rather than individually crafted for each deceased child, the crosses marking existing graves showed similar construction and weathering patterns. A mixture of frontier hospitality and barely concealed wariness that immediately set Brennan's professional instincts on edge was how Patrick Donnelly met him at the cabin door. Dramatically, since Harrison's descriptions from the previous year had the family patriarch aged. Completely white had his hair gone despite his apparent age of 45, and deep lines that suggested chronic stress rather than normal age increased his face. Slightly when he thought no one was watching trembled his hands, and a haunted quality that Brennan recognized from patients suffering from severe psychological trauma was held by his eyes. "We don't need a doctor here," Patrick said with forced firmness. But less conviction than his words suggested was carried by his voice. "We've always handled our own troubles, just as our families did in the old country. Bringing outsiders into family matters only complicates situations that are better resolved through traditional methods." Behind her husband appeared Bridget, and Brennan was shocked by the extent of her physical deterioration since Harrison's previous descriptions. Gaunt and hollow-eyed now looked the woman who had given birth just over a year earlier. So thin was her frame that her clothing hung like drapes over protruding bones. A constant tremor that could have indicated neurological problems, chronic malnutrition, or psychological stress severe enough to cause physical symptoms was shown by her hands. When she attempted to speak, a sharp look that suggested years of practiced dominance and consequences for disobedience that went beyond normal marital authority silenced her by Patrick. But the most disturbing evidence of the family's dark secrets and abnormal lifestyle was provided by the children. Clearly pregnant again was Moira, now 18, her condition advanced enough to suggest conception during the isolated winter months when no outsiders could have been present. Questions that Brennan found professionally and personally disturbing were raised by the implications of this timing, combined with the family's isolation and unusual genetic patterns. Signs of premature physical development that seemed accelerated beyond her chronological age were shown by Colleen, now 16. In ways that suggested hormonal abnormalities, possibly related to genetic factors or environmental influences, her adult features appeared fully formed. More troubling was her behavior around her parents. A combination of maturity and submissiveness that suggested experiences inappropriate for someone her age was displayed by her. Most disturbing was young Declan, now 13, who had developed pronounced physical abnormalities since Harrison's previous visits. Clear asymmetry was shown by the boy's facial features, with one side of his face appearing normally developed while the other showed signs of arrested growth or malformation. A pronounced limp that suggested spinal curvature was how he walked, and the elongated fingers and unusual joint flexibility that Brennan recognized as possible indicators of genetic connective tissue disorders were shown by his hands. Family dynamics that defied normal social conventions and suggested psychological pressures that went far beyond typical frontier hardships were observed by Brennan during his brief initial visit. A combination of fear and resignation that indicated consequences for disobedience far more severe than normal parental discipline was how the older children deferred to their parents. As if they had learned through experience that spontaneous behavior could trigger unpredictable and dangerous responses, their movements were careful and calculated. Eye contact with both his parents and the visiting doctor was avoided by Seamus, the eldest son at 20. To the point where he could barely communicate had his pronounced stutter worsened, and some internal struggle that left him visibly agitated throughout Brennan's visit seemed to be fought by him. When asked direct questions about family life or his own health, Seamus would begin to respond normally, then catch himself mid-sentence and fall silent, as if remembering severe consequences for revealing family information to outsiders. As abnormal for typical frontier households also struck Brennan were the family's living arrangements. Into more separate spaces than necessary for privacy alone was divided the cabin's interior, with heavy curtains and locked doors that seemed designed to conceal activities rather than simply organize family life. Ongoing activities that the family didn't want their visitor to observe were suggested by sounds from other parts of the cabin, and smells, medicinal, organic, and vaguely disturbing, that implied practices beyond normal frontier medicine or food preservation were there. As Brennan prepared to leave after his initial assessment, him aside with an urgency that bordered on desperation was pulled by Patrick. A man wrestling with competing desires to maintain family secrets and seek help for problems that had grown beyond his ability to manage alone was what his manner suggested. "Doctor," Patrick whispered, glancing nervously toward the cabin to ensure they weren't overheard by family members, "if I were to tell you that sometimes God tests families in ways that require terrible choices, would you understand what I mean? Would you be able to help without asking questions that might bring trouble to people who are already suffering?" Before Brennan could formulate a response, with increasing agitation continued Patrick, "Our bloodline carries great strength, but it also carries complications. We've learned to manage these complications through methods that our fathers and grandfathers developed over many generations. These methods have worked for us in the old country, but here in Montana, people ask different kinds of questions. They expect things that we cannot provide without revealing practices that wouldn't be understood by those who don't share our particular burdens." Chills through Brennan's professional composure were sent by the implications of Patrick's carefully worded confession. That the Donnelly family's isolation wasn't just about avoiding social scrutiny for unusual behavior was beginning to be understood by him. It was about hiding systematic practices that would horrify even the frontier's rough-and-tumble society, practices that had been refined and perfected over multiple generations before being transplanted to the American wilderness. 2 months after his initial visit, an urgent message from Jake Harrison that would force him to confront the full horror of the Donnelly family's genetic legacy was received by Dr. Brennan. By a local trapper who had risked the treacherous mountain trail was delivered the message, containing only a few hastily scrawled words: "Donnelly woman in bad labor. Family asking for doctor. Something wrong beyond normal birthing troubles. Come quick if you can." For the first time since their arrival in Montana Territory, outside medical assistance was being requested by the Donnelly family, a dramatic departure from their previous insistence on handling all family matters privately. That even their extensive experience with difficult births couldn't provide adequate solutions was suggested by complications so severe that they had overcome their obsessive secrecy to ask for help. On a sweltering July afternoon, Brennan arrived at the mountain cabin to find a scene that would haunt his nightmares for decades to come. The oppressive heat had turned the isolated valley into a furnace, and thick with humidity that made breathing difficult even for healthy individuals hung the air. Even more stifling was the atmosphere inside the cabin, heavy with the smells of sweat, blood, and something else, a sickly sweet odor that Brennan couldn't immediately identify, but that triggered his instincts as deeply wrong. In the cabin's back room lay Moira Donnelly, her labor complicated by factors that became immediately apparent to Brennan's trained eye. Twins were being given birth to by the young woman, but these weren't ordinary multiple births. At the torso were conjoined the infants, and they appeared to share major internal organs, a condition that Brennan knew was almost always fatal in an era before advanced surgical intervention. But the family's reaction to this obviously catastrophic development was what shocked him most, not the medical complexity of the situation. A cold, methodical response that suggested they had dealt with similar situations many times before was displayed by the Donnellys rather than the panic, grief, and desperate hope for divine intervention that he expected from parents facing such a tragedy. With the efficiency of people following a well-established protocol worked together Patrick and Bridget. Their movements were coordinated and purposeful rather than frantic. Materials and instruments that clearly weren't intended for celebrating a birth, but rather for managing a situation that required immediate and decisive action were prepared by Seamus and Colleen. A medical challenge that would have strained the resources of even the best-equipped hospitals of the era was presented by the twins themselves. Not only external tissue connections were shared by them, but they appeared to have integrated cardiovascular and nervous systems that made separation impossible with 1876 medical technology. Clearly stronger than the other was one infant, but signs of vitality that suggested they might survive for days or even weeks if provided with appropriate supportive care were shown by both. "Doctor," Patrick said with clinical detachment that chilled Brennan's blood, "we need you to tell us honestly whether they can be separated, whether there's any medical procedure that might allow one of them to survive as a normal child." As Brennan began his examination of the conjoined twins, something that made his blood run cold was noticed by him. Filled with detailed drawings and notes documenting similar births over what appeared to be many decades were leather-bound journals hidden beneath the birthing bed. Careful anatomical sketches of infants with various deformities, cleft palates, missing limbs, spinal malformations, extra digits, and conditions that Brennan had never seen illustrated with such clinical precision, were shown by page after page. With notes in Irish, Gaelic and English were annotated each drawing, dated entries that spanned several decades and multiple geographic locations. Detailed descriptions of remedial measures taken to address these genetic complications using terminology that suggested medical knowledge far beyond what typical frontier families would possess were included in some entries. The family's movements across Ireland and America over more than 50 years were traced by the dates and locations of the documented births, creating a pattern. The detailed anatomical studies that accompanied each birth record were the most disturbing. Not just the external deformities, but also speculative internal anatomy, potential survival prospects, and what the notes euphemistically called quality of life assessments were shown by the illustrations. The fact that these records documented systematic evaluation of newborn infants for traits that the family considered acceptable or unacceptable for survival couldn't be disguised by the clinical language. For the first time since his arrival, noticed his discovery and spoke Bridget, her voice carrying the weight of generations of terrible knowledge. "The bloodline must be kept pure, Doctor. Weakness cannot be allowed to spread and contaminate future generations. Through hard experience over many generations back in the old country, our family learned this truth. What looks like cruelty to outsiders is actually mercy, both for the children who would suffer and for the family line that must be preserved." With the conviction of someone reciting fundamental religious doctrine were her words delivered. But principles of human breeding that violated every standard of medical ethics and human decency that Brennan had learned during his professional training were involved in the doctrine she described. Not just infanticide was being practiced by the Donnelly family. They were conducting systematic genetic experimentation on their own children using principles of selective breeding that treated human beings as livestock to be improved through careful culling of undesirable traits. Additional evidence that revealed the true scope of the family's genetic manipulation was contained within the leather journals. Genealogical charts that traced the Donnelly bloodline through multiple generations, showing patterns of intermarriage between closely related family members that explained the high frequency of genetic abnormalities among their children, were hidden within the medical records. Not just husband and wife were Patrick and Bridget. They were also first cousins, continuing a pattern of deliberate inbreeding that extended back through 5 generations of carefully planned marriages designed to concentrate what the family believed were superior genetic traits. That the practice had begun in Ireland during the early 1800s when Patrick's great-grandfather had become convinced that the Irish people could be improved through selective breeding similar to the agricultural techniques used to develop superior livestock was revealed by the genealogical documentation. A twisted interpretation of biblical genealogies and pseudoscientific theories about racial superiority that had gained popularity among certain educated classes in Europe during that era had been used by the family to justify their systematic inbreeding. As Brennan continued examining the twins and studying the family's medical records, that he was witnessing the culmination of a genetic experiment that had been conducted across multiple generations with complete disregard for the suffering it caused was realized by him. Not a random tragedy, but the inevitable result of decades of systematic genetic manipulation that had finally produced abnormalities too severe to be hidden or rationalized away were represented by the conjoined infant struggling for breath in their makeshift cradle. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, intensifies the horror in the Montana mountains. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this disturbing tale of genetic manipulation and family secrets that spans generations of deliberate human experimentation. Decisions that would haunt his conscience for the rest of his career were forced upon Brennan by the immediate crisis of the conjoined twins. Clearly suffering were the infants. Their shared cardiovascular system was struggling to support 2 separate bodies, their breathing labored and irregular. With the primitive equipment available in the isolated mountain cabin was impossible medical intervention. But every principle of medical ethics that Brennan had sworn to uphold was violated by allowing them to suffer without attempting some form of relief. Through the night while the conjoined twins fought for their lives, Dr. Brennan studied the hidden journals. Terrifyingly clear became the true scope of the Donnelly family's genetic manipulation. Not just 5 generations of selective breeding and systematic infanticide, but a comprehensive program of human experimentation that had been practiced with scientific precision for over a century was documented by the records. How the original Donnelly patriarch, Fergus Donnelly, had begun the practice in County Cork during the 1790s after consulting with what the journal called learned men who understood the science of bloodlines and the improvement of human stock was described.